My name is Harper. I'm 34 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've worked in corporate accounting. Numbers have always made more sense to me than people. Numbers follow rules. They balance, or they don't. They don't flatter you. They don't pretend. They tell the truth if you know how to look at them. If you met me in an elevator, you probably wouldn't remember me. I'm not loud. I don't interrupt. I don't dress to be noticed. I prefer navy, charcoal, and cream, clean lines, minimal jewelry. I've been told I have a calming presence, which is often just a polite way of saying I don't take up much space. At work, I was the reliable one, the steady one, the woman who stayed late during quarter end without complaining, the one who fixed spreadsheet errors quietly before anyone else noticed. I wasn't the visionary. I wasn't the rainmaker. I wasn't the person giving speeches in all-hands meetings. I was the one making sure the foundation didn't crack. And for a long time, that invisibility felt safe. This story isn't about revenge. It's not about dramatic showdowns or shouting matches in glass conference rooms. It's about a single request made the night before a tax inspection. A request phrased as a favor, as teamwork, as loyalty. My boss asked me to fix the numbers. What he called an adjustment could have sent me to prison. That sentence still feels heavy in my mouth. What unfolded after that wasn't explosive. It was quiet, almost painfully quiet. There were no slammed doors, no secret recordings, no sudden heroes stepping in to save the day. Just decisions. Small, deliberate, irreversible decisions. This is a story about how easy it is to underestimate the person who keeps everything running, about how silence can look like weakness when it's actually restraint, about what happens when someone who has spent years being useful decides to become immovable instead. I'll tell you who I was to them. I'll tell you the small moments I ignored, the rationalizations, the subtle shifts. I'll tell you what I learned about power. Not the loud kind, but the structural kind. The kind that doesn't announce itself. And I'll be honest about the fear because there was fear. Real stomach-tightening fear. Not just of losing a job, but of losing my integrity, my future, my freedom. By the end, no one was destroyed. No one was humiliated. But nothing was the same. Have you ever been seen as the dependable one and wondered what would happen if you stopped absorbing the weight for everyone else? To them, I was predictable, not in a bad way, in a useful way. I arrived at 7:45 every morning, 15 minutes before most of the finance team. I made my coffee the same way, no sugar, a splash of oat milk. I reviewed the previous day's reconciliations before opening my email. I flagged inconsistencies without fanfare and corrected them without commentary. No one ever had to wonder whether Harper would get it done. And because of that, no one ever wondered much about Harper at all. In meetings, I sat halfway down the table, not at the head, not at the far end. Close enough to speak if needed, far enough not to command attention. When projections were presented, I listened. When someone quoted a number slightly off, I would gently clarify. Actually, it's 12.4%, not 14.2%. Always soft, always factual, never accusatory. People smiled at me the way you smile at someone reliable, the way you smile at the IT person who fixes your laptop. Appreciative, dismissive, grateful, but not curious. My boss, Daniel, used to call me his safety net. He meant it as a compliment. If anything slips through, he'd say in meetings, gesturing vaguely in my direction, "Harper will catch it." The room would nod, someone would chuckle, and we'd move on. I caught things. Duplicate vendor payments, misclassified expenses, a nearly missed payroll tax adjustment that would have triggered penalties. I fixed errors that never made it high enough to become stories. And because I fixed them quietly, they never became proof of my value. They became proof that nothing was wrong. That was the paradox of being competent. The smoother everything ran, the less anyone noticed the person holding the gears in place. I wasn't excluded. I wasn't mistreated. I was simply absorbed. During quarterly celebrations, Daniel would thank the leadership team first. Operations, sales, strategy. Then he'd add, almost as an afterthought, and of course, thanks to finance for keeping us compliant. Finance, not Harper. I told myself it didn't matter. Titles didn't matter. Applause didn't matter. Stability mattered. Integrity mattered. I had seen what instability did to a household. I had watched my father sit at our kitchen table, staring at documents he trusted someone else to prepare. I had watched the slow realization that signatures carry consequences. So I built my life around control, around precision. If my name were attached to something, it would be correct. At work, that translated into a reputation: steady, loyal, discreet, safe. And when you are perceived as safe, people begin to assume you will always absorb risk on their behalf. Not because you agreed to, but because you never complained. I didn't network aggressively. I didn't angle for promotions. I didn't interrupt when louder voices reframed ideas I had quietly suggested minutes earlier. I told myself I preferred the background. The background is stable. The background doesn't get blamed. At least that's what I believed. What I didn't understand yet was that invisibility doesn't protect you from being assigned responsibility. It only ensures you won't see it coming. To them, I was the one who would fix things. They just never imagined there would be something I wouldn't. The first cut wasn't dramatic. It didn't come with raised voices or accusations. It came wrapped in a compliment. It was a Tuesday afternoon in early March. We were closing Q1 projections, and the numbers were tight, not catastrophic, just tight enough to make leadership uncomfortable. Revenue had dipped slightly below forecast. A delayed client payment had shifted our liquidity ratios just enough to look fragile. Daniel stood behind my chair instead of sitting across from me. That was the first thing I noticed. He leaned in, scanning my monitor. "Walk me through this again," he said. I explained the variance: the delayed receivable, the adjusted expense timing, the compliance implications of recognizing revenue prematurely. He nodded, but I could feel impatience in the silence between his breaths. "What if," he began carefully, "we reclassified part of that receivable as anticipated revenue? Just temporarily. It evens out the quarter. We'll correct it next month when the payment clears." I didn't answer immediately. I clicked into the ledger, pulled up the relevant code, and let the numbers sit between us. "That would misstate the quarter," I said finally, calm, neutral. He smiled, not irritated, not defensive, just persuasive. "Harper, it's not a misstatement, it's smooth. Every company does it. We know the money is coming." The room felt smaller, though nothing had changed. Every company does it. It was such an easy phrase, soft, normalizing, designed to make resistance feel naive. I kept my tone even. "If the inspection team looks at timing differences, it could raise flags." "They won't," he replied quickly, "and if they do, we'll explain. It's within reason." Within reason? That was the second softening. He wasn't asking me to fabricate revenue from nothing. He wasn't asking for forged documents. He was asking for a classification shift, a timing adjustment, a gray area. Gray areas are where people learn who they are. I turned in my chair slightly so we were face to face. "I'm not comfortable reclassifying it before it's received." There was a pause, a small one, barely noticeable. Then he exhaled through his nose and straightened up. "Okay," he said lightly, "you're the compliance queen." He laughed, a short, dismissive sound. I smiled politely. He walked away. That was it. No reprimand, no threat. The numbers stayed as they were. The quarter closed honestly, even if it looked weaker. But something had shifted. The next day, in a leadership meeting, Daniel presented the financial summary. When he reached the revenue slide, he added casually, "Finance opted for a conservative classification approach this quarter." Finance opted. Not I chose. Not what we discussed. Not compliance required. Finance opted. It was subtle, but the implication lingered in the air. We could have looked stronger. We chose not to. After the meeting, one of the operations managers stopped by my desk. "Rough quarter, huh?" he said. "It's accurate," I replied. He gave a tight smile. "Yeah, accurate." As if accuracy were a personality flaw. That was the first cut. Not the request itself, but the reframing of my integrity as rigidity, as a caution that cost the company optics. I told myself it didn't matter. The numbers were correct. That was the job. But I began to understand something uncomfortable. Saying no doesn't create a scene. It creates a label. And once someone labels you as the obstacle to flexibility, they stop seeing you as protection. They start seeing you as a problem to work around. I didn't know it then, but that small, almost forgettable Tuesday was the moment Daniel stopped viewing me as his safety net and started testing whether I could be adjusted. After that Tuesday, nothing obvious changed. Daniel still greeted me in the mornings. He still forwarded emails with, "Can you sanity check this?" He still introduced me to new hires as the one who keeps us out of trouble. But the tone shifted, subtly, gradually, enough that if you tried to describe it to someone, you'd sound paranoid. The next time it happened, it wasn't about revenue. It was about expenses. We were reviewing discretionary spending before the upcoming tax inspection. Travel reimbursements, vendor contracts, marketing allocations. Daniel leaned back in his chair and tapped his pen against the conference table. "Do we need to break this out so granularly?" he asked. nodding toward my breakdown of consulting fees. It makes it look heavier than it feels. It is heavy, I replied, and it's accurate. He gave that same tight smile. Right, but presentation matters. Presentation, another soft word. He didn't tell me to hide anything. He suggested grouping line items differently. Cleaner, he said, less noisy. Technically, the grouping wouldn't have been illegal. It would just make it harder to trace the true allocation without digging deeper. I adjusted the format, but not the substance. When I sent the revised report, I included a detailed internal version in the archive. Quietly, no announcement. That became my pattern. He would suggest softening. I would preserve truth and structure. Outwardly compliant, internally precise. The comments grew more frequent. You're very by the book, Harper. You know we operate in the real world, right? Sometimes flexibility is leadership. Each sentence was delivered lightly, almost playfully, always in front of someone else. Never hostile enough to confront, just sharp enough to sting. I began noticing how often my name appeared in disclaimers. Finances being cautious. Harper flagged a risk. Accounting prefers to wait. Not we, not the company, not as required. Harper. It wasn't overt blame, it was a distance. And I told myself it was fine. I told myself I was too sensitive. That this was normal executive pressure. That leaders push boundaries and compliance pushes back. That friction was part of the system. I rationalized staying quiet because I valued stability. Because I believed good work would eventually speak for itself. Because I had seen what happened when emotions overtook professionalism. I remembered my father's voice when he found out his business partner had altered documents without telling him. I trusted him, he'd said. Trust without verification. That phrase lived in me like a warning. So I verified everything. I archived emails. I saved drafts. I documented verbal requests and follow-up summaries. Always polite, always neutral. Per our discussion, we are maintaining the current classification. Confirming that we will not adjust revenue recognition at this time. No accusations, just clarity. If Daniel noticed, he never said. But the environment grew warmer. Not friendly warm, pressurized warm. I started being left off smaller strategy calls, not major ones. Just the early conversations where framing happened. I would receive the numbers after the narrative had already been decided. Can you make this align, someone would ask? Align, that word again. It meant make the numbers support the story. And every time I didn't, every time I sent back a spreadsheet that gently contradicted optimism, every time I refused to stretch timing, I felt the room cool. No one yelled, no one accused. They simply adjusted around me. The normalization wasn't in one big event. It was in repetition. A joke here, a sigh there, a meeting invite that arrived 5 minutes before it started. I absorbed it. Because I believed integrity required endurance. Because I believed that as long as I wasn't explicitly asked to cross a line, I was still safe. What I didn't realize was that by tolerating the erosion of respect, I was being positioned, not as a partner, but as a tool. And tools don't get asked how they feel before they're used. There's a moment in every workplace when you realize you're no longer being seen as a person. You're being seen as a function. For me, that realization didn't arrive in a confrontation. It arrived in a calendar invite. Pre-inspection alignment, leadership only. I wasn't on it. I found out about the meeting because one of the junior analysts accidentally forwarded me a preparation document that referenced it. Bullet points, talking points, risk narratives, a draft explanation for anticipated revenue timing. Anticipated. That word again. I scrolled through the document slowly. It wasn't fraudulent. Not yet. It was positioning, framing, a strategy for how to speak about the numbers in the most favorable light possible. But what struck me wasn't the content. It was the absence. No compliance notes, no internal audit references, no legal cross-check. Just optics. I waited to see if a separate meeting invite would arrive for finance. It didn't. At 4:12 p.m., Daniel walked past my desk and said casually, "We're just aligning messaging for tomorrow. I'll loop you in if anything technical comes up." If anything technical comes up, as if my presence was only required when a formula broke. That was the moment I understood the role I had been assigned. Reliable, useful, invisible. I was there to clean, not to shape. To validate, not to influence. To fix, not to decide. And in that role, my silence had been interpreted as agreement. When you don't challenge being sidelined, people assume you're comfortable there. That evening, I stayed late. Not because there was extra work, but because I needed quiet. I pulled up the last 3 years of audit trails. I reviewed email threads I had archived. I traced small shifts in language. Can we explore? Is there room? Just temporarily. The requests had grown incrementally more confident, not reckless, comfortable. comfortable that I would either adjust or absorb. I realized something uncomfortable about myself, too. Part of me had taken pride in being indispensable, in being the one who cleaned up quietly, in being the steady presence others relied on. But indispensability without authority is a trap. It keeps you close enough to carry responsibility, but far enough to avoid recognition. I picked up my mechanical pencil, the silver one with my father's initials, and rolled it between my fingers. If my name is attached to it, it must be true. That was my rule. But what happens when your name is attached to something you didn't shape? When leadership tells a story about numbers you prepared, but frames them in ways you didn't approve, you're still accountable. The next morning, I walked into the office aware of something new. They didn't see me as a strategic voice. They saw me as structural support. And structures in their minds don't have agency. They exist to hold weight. But structures also determine whether a building stands or collapses. That was the shift. Not anger, not defiance. Clarity. I wasn't invisible because I lacked value. I was invisible because I had allowed my value to be defined by service. And if they believed I would always stabilize whatever they tilted, they had misunderstood something fundamental about me. I would not tilt truth to preserve comfort, and I would not allow my silence to be mistaken for surrender. The actual shift didn't happen in the boardroom. It didn't happen during a tense exchange or a veiled comment. It happened at 9:38 p.m., alone at my kitchen table. The night before the tax inspection, my laptop was open. The city outside my apartment window was quiet in that particular way Chicago gets when the wind settles and the traffic thins. I had been reviewing documentation one last time, cross-checking ledger summaries against supporting invoices, verifying that audit trails were clean. Everything balanced. Everything was defensible. At 9:41 p.m., my phone buzzed. Daniel. I let it ring once before answering. "Hey, Harper," he said, his tone easy. Too easy for that hour. "Sorry to bother you this late." "It's fine," I replied. There was a pause, just long enough to signal this wasn't routine. "I've been looking at the deferred vendor credits," he began. "The ones tied to the Q2 logistics contract." I already knew where this was going. "They're correctly classified," I said evenly. "Right, technically, yes. But if we reallocate a portion as an operational offset, it strengthens the liquidity ratio going into tomorrow." There it was. Not a suggestion, a plan. "It wouldn't be accurate," I said. "It's defensible," he corrected gently. "There's flexibility in interpretation. We're not inventing anything." What he called an adjustment could have sent me to prison. He didn't say that part out loud. He framed it as teamwork. "I just need you to tweak the allocation tonight," he continued. "We'll normalize it next quarter. It smooths the optics. No one's harmed." No one's harmed. I stared at the spreadsheet open in front of me, at the columns of numbers that had taken months of disciplined reporting to maintain, at the clean audit trail. "I'm not comfortable doing that," I said. Silence. Then a different tone entered his voice, not angry, not yet. "Harper," he said quietly, "I need to know you're aligned with leadership on this." Aligned. That word again. "This inspection matters," he continued. "If they see volatility, they dig. If they dig, they question everything. We can avoid that. Avoid scrutiny by preemptively manipulating perception." The irony was almost elegant. I didn't argue. I didn't lecture about compliance law or regulatory exposure. I simply said, "The numbers are accurate as they stand." His exhale was sharp this time. "So that's your position?" "Yes." Another pause. Longer. "Okay," he said finally. "I'll make a note of that." The call ended. I sat there for a full minute without moving. He'll make a note of that. It wasn't a threat. It was something colder, administrative, measured. In that moment, I felt fear, not of him, but of what I had just chosen. Refusing wasn't dramatic. It didn't come with applause. It came with consequences I couldn't yet see. But something inside me settled. For months, I had been absorbing the subtle pressure, the reframing, the isolation from strategic conversations, the soft jokes about rigidity. That night, the pressure crystallized into clarity. He wasn't testing flexibility anymore. He was testing compliance. And I understood something with absolute precision. If I adjusted those numbers, even slightly, I would become part of the narrative, not the guardian of it. If the inspection escalated, if discrepancies were discovered, my name would be on the filings. Not his, mine. The shift wasn't defiance, it was ownership. I wasn't just protecting the company, I was protecting myself. And for the first time, I realized that silence could no longer mean endurance. It had to mean strategy. The next morning, I arrived at the office 10 minutes earlier than usual, not because I had more work, because I needed stillness. The fluorescent lights hadn't fully warmed up yet. The office felt suspended, like a stage before actors take their marks. I placed my bag under my desk, powered on my computer, and reviewed the files one last time. unchanged, untouched, accurate. Daniel walked in at 8:12 a.m. He didn't stop by my desk. He didn't reference the call from the night before. In the kitchen area, I could hear his voice, light, conversational, already in performance mode. When the inspection team arrived, the tone shifted across the floor. Softer voices, straighter postures, controlled breathing. I sat in the conference room with my laptop open, prepared to answer documentation questions. Daniel led the narrative. He spoke confidently about growth strategy, operational resilience, and disciplined forecasting. Disciplined. That word almost made me smile. When the inspectors asked about revenue timing variances, he gestured toward me. Harper can walk you through the classification methodology. Of course, I explained the timing differences clearly. I cited policy. I referenced compliance guidelines. I showed the audit trail. No improvisation, no embellishment, just facts. The inspectors nodded, took notes, and moved on. Daniel didn't look at me, and that's when I understood something essential. Silence is only a weakness when it's reactive. When it's chosen, it becomes structure. I wasn't quiet because I was intimidated. I was quiet because I was observing. Over the next week, I noticed small adjustments in behavior. I wasn't invited to 2 executive lunches. Daniel delegated more vision-facing meetings to a newer finance manager. My responsibilities remained heavy, but my proximity to strategic discussions shrank. It was subtle distancing, a quiet repositioning. He wasn't punishing me publicly. That would draw attention. He was creating optionality. If needed, I could be framed as overly conservative, resistant, not commercially aligned. I didn't confront him. I didn't ask why. Instead, I began documenting more deliberately, not emotionally, methodically. I organized archived emails by topic. I created secure backups of policy confirmations. I ensured that every financial decision had a written trail clarifying authorship. Per your instruction, confirming leadership decision, neutral, professional, precise. Silence became my shield and my preparation. In meetings, when Daniel reframed numbers optimistically, I didn't interrupt. I waited. If someone asked directly, I answered. If not, I let the optimism stand, because optimism without documentation collapses under scrutiny on its own. I stopped volunteering corrections unless they impacted formal reporting. That was new for me. Previously, I had felt responsible for preemptively stabilizing everything. Now, I allowed minor misalignments to exist, knowing they would surface naturally when reality caught up. Others mistook my restraint for retreat. I saw it in the way one colleague said, "Harper's taking a step back lately." I wasn't stepping back. I was stepping sideways, creating distance between myself and decisions I did not control. For the first time, I understood power not as visibility, but as positioning. I didn't need to win arguments. I needed to ensure that when lines were drawn, my name stood on the correct side of them. And the more Daniel assumed I would eventually yield, the calmer I became. Because people are most careless when they believe the quiet person won't move. What they never consider, is it that quiet people move differently? If you had walked past my desk that month, you would have seen nothing unusual. Spreadsheets, reports, headphones on. The same navy blazer was draped over the back of my chair. What you wouldn't have seen was the shift in what I paid attention to. I stopped focusing solely on accuracy. I started focusing on patterns. Who requested adjustments verbally instead of in writing? Who copied legal on emails, and who didn't? Which projections were revised last minute before board presentations? How often the phrase temporary reclassification appeared in internal threads? I wasn't looking for a scandal. I was mapping behavior. Every system has pressure points. In accounting, they're usually timing, categorization, and narrative framing. None of those are inherently illegal. But when pressure increases, when growth expectations tighten, when inspections loom, those are the levers people pull. I began quietly strengthening my side of the structure. First, I reviewed the company policy against federal compliance requirements, line by line. I printed the sections relevant to revenue recognition and expense allocation and highlighted areas where interpretation had limits. Second, I ensured that access logs were clear. Every financial adjustment had a digital fingerprint. Every change in classification left a trail. Third, I requested small clarifications in writing. Just to confirm, we are not accelerating recognition on this receivable. Confirming we will maintain standard allocation methodology for vendor credits. Polite, neutral. Most of the time, Daniel responded with brief affirmations. Yes, keep standard. Let's stay conservative for now. For now. That phrase appeared more frequently. The new finance manager, Alex, started sitting closer to Daniel in meetings. He was ambitious, sharp, and eager to please. I watched how he responded to suggestions. When Daniel said, Is there room to interpret this more favorably? Alex would say. We can explore options. Explore. I recognized the slope immediately. One afternoon, Alex stopped by my desk. You're very strict with classifications, he said, not unkindly. There's often more flexibility than you think. Flexibility for who? I asked calmly. He hesitated, then smiled. For the business. The business. It's interesting how often that word is used, as if it's separate from the people legally responsible for it. I didn't argue, I simply nodded. What they never noticed was that I had begun consulting externally. Not formally, not as a complaint, but as education. I reached out to a former professor who now worked in regulatory compliance. Framed it as a professional development conversation. Hypothetically, I asked, how do regulators interpret timing discrepancies if they see a pattern? His answer was clear. They don't look at one quarter. They look at behavior over time. Intent becomes visible through repetition. Intent becomes visible through repetition. That sentence settled into me like stone. I wasn't waiting for a dramatic request anymore. I was evaluating the trajectory, and the trajectory was bending toward normalization. More what-if conversations. More narrative shaping before numbers were finalized. More subtle positioning of finance as cautious rather than correct. Meanwhile, I updated my resume. Not impulsively, strategically. I listed measurable achievements, compliance improvements, audit clean records, risk mitigation savings. I reached out to 2 professional contacts, not for jobs, but for conversations. I didn't plan to leave immediately, but I needed optionality. Power isn't loud, it's optionality. If the environment shifted further, I would not be cornered. At home, I created a secure digital archive. Backups of policy documents, email confirmations, audit summaries, stored legally, privately, appropriately. Not to weaponize, to protect. There's a difference. The office atmosphere grew slightly tighter as the next board review approached. Daniel spent more time behind closed doors. Alex grew more confident in meetings, occasionally speaking over me when interpretations were discussed. I let him, because I had already positioned myself where it mattered on record. On paper, in documented confirmation, they saw a woman becoming quieter. They didn't see a woman becoming isolated. And insulation doesn't announce itself. It simply ensures that when pressure finally hits, the structure that bends won't be yours. The discovery didn't feel dramatic. There was no gasp, no sudden rush of vindication. It was a Tuesday evening again. Strange how turning points often choose ordinary days. I was reconciling quarterly adjustments when I noticed something small, too small for most people to question. A vendor credit from 6 months prior had been reclassified, subtly shifted from deferred liability to operational offset. Not by me. I clicked into the audit trail. User A. Mercer. Timestamp 11:48 p.m. Approval D. Keller, Alex, and Daniel. The adjustment itself wasn't illegal on its surface. It was arguable, debatable. But when paired with similar micro-adjustments over the previous 2 quarters, it formed a pattern. Intent becomes visible through repetition. I leaned back in my chair and let my eyes rest on the screen. They hadn't asked me this time. They had moved around me. That was the reveal. Not that something catastrophic had happened, but that they no longer needed my consent to test boundaries. I opened archived reports from prior quarters and began layering the data side by side. Timing shifts, minor reclassifications, strategic smoothing before key reviews. Individually defensible, collectively directional. The pattern wasn't explosive enough to report, but it was enough to understand leverage. Because here's what most people misunderstand about compliance professionals. We don't need chaos to recognize risk. We need a trajectory. The trajectory was now documented. I exported the audit logs, not to my personal drive, not illegally, but into a secure compliance folder with restricted access. A folder that required dual authorization for deletion. Standard protocol. Quiet insurance. The next morning, Daniel called a brief meeting. We're refining how finance integrates with strategic growth, he said, standing at the front of the room. Alex will take a more forward-facing role in projections. Forward-facing. I nodded once. No resistance, no visible reaction. What he didn't know was that the reclassification trail meant something important. If scrutiny ever intensified, documentation showed that I had not authorized the shifts. In fact, my prior written confirmations explicitly maintained standard methodology. I wasn't just insulated. I was separated. That's when clarity replaced tension. I didn't need to expose anyone. I didn't need confrontation. The system would correct itself if the pressure increased. And if it didn't, I had options. That evening, I scheduled a consultation with an external employment attorney, not to file a claim, not to escalate, but to understand boundaries. What are my obligations? I asked hypothetically, if I become aware of accounting interpretations that feel progressively aggressive. The attorney's response was measured. Document, maintain professionalism. If it crosses into misrepresentation, you protect yourself first. Protect yourself first. For years, I had equated professionalism with endurance. Now I understand it as positioning. At work, nothing outwardly changed. I still arrived at 7:45, still corrected ledger inconsistencies, still answered the inspector's follow-ups calmly. But internally, the dynamic had shifted. Daniel believed he had reduced friction by sidelining me. In reality, he had reduced his buffer, because I was no longer absorbing questionable interpretations before they materialized. I was observing it after. There's a quiet kind of power that comes from understanding you are no longer dependent on approval, that your value is portable, that your integrity is documented. When I realized I had leverage, not explosive leverage, not scandal leverage, but structural leverage, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady, because leverage isn't about control, it's about clarity. And clarity meant one thing: if the line moved again, I would not debate it. I would act. The next request didn't come late at night. It came at 2:17 p.m. in broad daylight. Daniel stepped into my office and closed the glass door halfway. Not fully shut, but enough to signal privacy. "We need to talk about Q3 positioning," he said. "Positioning?" I gestured for him to sit. He didn't. Instead, he placed a printed summary on my desk. I recognized the numbers immediately: projected revenue, deferred credits, expense allocations. But 2 lines were highlighted. "We're going to standardize this approach moving forward," he said calmly. "The reallocation model Alex implemented last quarter, it works." "It works. For optics?" I asked. "For sustainability," he corrected. "Investors want predictability. Volatility raises questions." "And accuracy?" I asked, my tone even. He held my gaze for a moment. "Harper," he said, softer now, "you're technically right most of the time. But leadership requires judgment. Interpretation is part of the role." Interpretation. There it was again, the softening language around structural shifts. He continued, "I need finance unified on this, no mixed messaging. Unified, not compliant, unified." I looked at the highlighted lines again. The reallocation wasn't fabricated. It wasn't invented revenue, but it blurred timing enough that, if compounded, it would materially distort the year-end presentation. Intent becomes visible through repetition. This was repetition. In that moment, I saw 3 options clearly. First, comply quietly, adjust the classifications, stay employed, accept the new direction, and protect my position internally. Second, confront aggressively, escalate to the board, trigger an internal investigation, burn every bridge in the process. Third, remove myself strategically and ensure that any future scrutiny would not entangle me. Only one option was irreversible in the right way. I folded my hands on the desk. "I'm not comfortable standardizing this approach," I said. His jaw tightened slightly, not anger, calculation. "So what are you saying?" "I'm saying I won't sign off on it." A pause. "You're part of the leadership team," he replied evenly. "This isn't optional." "It is for my name," I said quietly. That sentence shifted the air between us, because this wasn't about policy anymore. It was about liability. "If you're unwilling to align," he said carefully, "we may need to reconsider role structure." There it was. Not a threat, a path. Reconsider role structure. I nodded once. "I understand." He studied me, perhaps expecting negotiation. Fear, a request for compromise. Instead, he saw stillness, because the decision had already been made. Not in that room, not in that minute, but weeks earlier when I documented patterns, when I secured backups, when I updated my resume, when I consulted the legal boundaries. I wasn't choosing between loyalty and rebellion. I was choosing between dependence and autonomy. And autonomy requires sacrifice. After he left, I drafted a brief follow-up email. "Per our discussion, I am not able to authorize the proposed reallocation methodology as a standardized practice. Please advise if you would like to transition approval authority for this classification." Polite, clinical, clear. Then I saved it. Didn't send it yet, because the irreversible decision wasn't just a refusal. It was timing. That evening, I scheduled a meeting with Human Resources for the following week. Not to complain, to explore transition terms. And for the first time since that late-night phone call before the inspection, I felt no fear, only resolve. Because once you understand your leverage, the question is no longer whether you'll act. It's when. The week before my HR meeting, I behaved exactly as expected. That was intentional. I attended finance syncs. I reviewed expense reports. I corrected a minor payroll discrepancy that would have triggered penalties if left unresolved. I even congratulated Alex on a clean projection deck. No one suspects movement when routine remains intact. HR scheduled our conversation for Thursday at 3 p.m. The calendar description read, Role Alignment Discussion. Neutral. When I walked into the small conference room, Melissa from HR smiled politely. She had a legal pad open, pen ready. What's on your mind, Harper? She asked. I didn't accuse anyone. I didn't mention misconduct. I spoke in language HR understands. Role clarity, professional alignment, risk tolerance. I'm concerned about increasing divergence between compliance standards and strategic positioning, I said calmly. If classification authority is shifting, I'd like formal documentation clarifying responsibility. Melissa nodded slowly. Are you requesting a title adjustment? I'm requesting liability clarity, I replied. That made her pause. I want written confirmation of the decision ownership if accounting methodology changes in ways I don't authorize. There it was. No drama, just structure. By the end of the meeting, 2 things were agreed upon. First, if reallocation methodology became standardized under Alex's direction, the approval authority would formally transfer. Second, any financial statements I did not sign would reflect that clearly. Paper separates pressure from consequence. The following Monday, Daniel called another leadership meeting. He announced a streamlined reporting model and confirmed that Alex would oversee forward projections and classification strategy. My title remained. My compensation remained. But my signature authority on certain classifications quietly shifted. On paper, it looked like a delegation. In reality, it was insulation. Over the next month, I moved carefully. I updated my LinkedIn profile, subtly, without an announcement. I responded to a recruiter's message. I attended 2 interviews during lunch hours, framing them as industry conversations. Meanwhile, internally, I maintained professionalism. I answered direct compliance questions. I ensured payroll, tax filings, and statutory reports were impeccable. If scrutiny ever arose, my domain would be clean. One afternoon, an email thread circulated regarding a particularly aggressive revenue smoothing proposal for year-end optics. Alex approved it. Daniel replied, looks good. I was copied. Previously, I would have interjected. This time, I did something different. I replied with 1 sentence. Noted. Approval authority acknowledged. Nothing more. No critique. No correction. That email was archived automatically in compliance folders. Silence documented. Weeks passed. Then came the external auditor's preliminary inquiry. Routine, nothing dramatic. A request for clarification on timing differences across quarters. I provided documentation for areas under my authority. For the reallocation segments, I responded, please direct classification rationale inquiries to A. Mercer per updated reporting structure. Accurate, professional. The inquiry didn't escalate yet, but something shifted in the office atmosphere. A slight tightening, a few closed-door conversations. Daniel stopped making eye contact in passing. Alex grew more defensive in meetings. No one confronted me, because I hadn't confronted anyone. I had simply stepped out of the blast radius. When you move in silence, consequences don't announce themselves immediately. They accumulate. They reveal gaps slowly, and the people who once assumed you would absorb risk begin to realize you're no longer standing where they left you. Consequences rarely arrive like thunder. They begin as discomfort. 2 weeks after the preliminary auditor inquiry, a second email came through. This one is more detailed. It requested comparative justification for classification shifts over the last 3 quarters, specifically the vendor credit reallocations. The subject line was calm, procedural, but the request was precise. I read it once, then again. Intent becomes visible through repetition. The pattern had become visible. Alex walked past my office twice that morning. The 3rd time, he stopped. Did you see the auditor follow-up? He asked, keeping his voice casual. Yes, I said. They're overanalyzing timing, he muttered. It's within interpretive range. I'm sure you'll explain your rationale clearly, I replied. Your rationale, not ours. He nodded stiffly and walked away. That afternoon, Daniel called a brief executive huddle. Without me, I wasn't surprised. 10 minutes later, my inbox pinged. Harper, can you pull supporting documentation for Q2 deferred credits? Of course. I pulled everything under my authority. Clean logs, unaltered classifications, email confirmations where I had explicitly declined standardizing reallocation methodology. I sent the files promptly. Then one line. For classification decisions executed under the updated reporting structure, please reference A. Mercer. The office atmosphere grew denser over the next few days. Conversations quieted when I approached the kitchen area. Alex stayed later than usual. Daniel's door remained closed more often. No one accused me of anything, because there was nothing to accuse. But the weight they once expected me to carry was now sitting elsewhere. And it was heavier than they anticipated. By Friday, the auditors requested a live clarification call. I was invited, but not as lead. Alex spoke first, confident at the start, emphasizing industry norms, strategic smoothing, interpretive flexibility. The auditors listened patiently. Then one of them asked, "Was this methodology reviewed by your senior compliance officer?" Silence. A small one. Alex glanced toward me. Before he could speak, I answered calmly. Approval authority for those classifications transitioned last quarter. My documented position remains aligned with standard timing recognition. No hostility, no elaboration, just a fact. The auditor nodded slowly and made a note. The call ended without escalation, but the air afterward felt different. For the first time, Daniel didn't avoid eye contact. He looked at me directly in the hallway, not angry, assessing, because he understood now. The safety net had moved, and without it, every step required balance. Over the next week, more documentation was requested. Nothing explosive, nothing criminal, just deeper scrutiny. Scrutiny takes time. It requires explanation. It exposes internal disagreement, and disagreement makes leadership uncomfortable. Alex became shorter in meetings. Daniel spoke less about interpretation and more about consistency. Language shifting again. Meanwhile, I continued performing my role precisely. Payroll processed. Tax filings are clean. Expense audits are accurate. Untouchable areas. One afternoon, Melissa from HR stopped by my desk. "Just checking in," she said gently. "Everything okay?" "Yes," I replied. "Everything's documented." She held my gaze for a moment, then nodded. That was the beginning. Not collapse, not a scandal. Just gravity. When you remove silent support from a structure built on an assumption, the structure doesn't fall immediately. It creaks. And the people who leaned hardest feel it first. Panic doesn't always look like chaos. Sometimes it looks like forced optimism. 2 days after the auditor call, Daniel scheduled a one-on-one with me. No agenda attached. When I stepped into his office, he was standing by the window, arms crossed. The city skyline behind him looked muted, almost gray. "Close the door," he said gently. I did. He didn't sit. Neither did I. "We need to present a unified explanation," he began. "The auditors are reading too much into standard practice." "Standard practice. That's your interpretation," I said calmly. He exhaled slowly. "Harper, this doesn't need to escalate. If we clarify that finance agreed to the reallocation approach, it resolves the tension." There it was, not an adjustment this time. A retroactive alignment. "You're asking me to state that I approved methodology I explicitly declined," I replied. "I'm asking you to acknowledge collective intent," he corrected. Collective intent. It was almost impressive, how language kept softening the edge of accountability. I shook my head once. "My position is documented." His jaw tightened. "You understand how this looks?" he asked quietly. "Internal disagreement during inspection invites deeper review." "Internal disagreement documented before inspection protects the company," I answered. That was the moment something in him shifted, from persuasion to realization. He wasn't dealing with resistance anymore. He was dealing with a record. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said. "No," I replied evenly. "I'm making it clear." Silence filled the office. Not angry, heavy. He ran a hand across his face, a crack in composure I hadn't seen before. "We can still frame this as a strategic pivot," he said finally, "but we need consistency." Consistency. The word had replaced flexibility. "It's too late for reframing," I said quietly. "The documentation exists." And that was the truth. Not a threat, a fact. Once intent is traceable, narrative control weakens. Over the next week, auditors requested expanded comparative analysis. Board members were looped into review threads. Legal counsel attended 2 calls. Nothing explosive surfaced, but the deeper they looked, the more evident the divergence became. Not fraud, but pattern. Pattern invites scrutiny. Alex stopped initiating conversation with me entirely. Daniel became measured and careful with every email, every sentence documented. The informal tone disappeared. One afternoon, I overheard Daniel in a closed-door conversation. "We should have consolidated reporting earlier." Should have. Regret is quiet. It doesn't shout. It recalculates. HR called another meeting, this time with legal present. Not accusatory, procedural, reviewing governance structures. My documentation was referenced. My written confirmations, my declined authorizations. No one blamed me. They couldn't, because I hadn't attacked anyone. I had simply refused to participate. And refusal, when documented early enough, becomes distance. By the end of the month, the board recommended formal separation of the projection strategy from compliance oversight, publicly framed as governance improvement. Privately, it was containment. Daniel stopped asking for alignment. He started asking for clarification. Too late to fix intent. Too late to merge authorship. Too late to pull my name back into decisions I had stepped away from months earlier. The line had been drawn quietly, and once drawn, it doesn't erase itself because someone wishes it had been softer. The final conversation happened on a Wednesday morning. No raised voices, no witnesses. Daniel asked me to step into the larger conference room this time, the one with the long walnut table and the city view that executives like to reference in presentations. He was already seated when I walked in. A folder sat in front of him. "Have a seat, Harper." I did. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The tension that had once felt sharp now felt settled, like dust after movement. "The board is restructuring financial oversight," he began. "Projection strategy and compliance will be formally separated. Reporting lines will adjust." "I'm aware," I said. He nodded. "There will also be leadership changes," he continued carefully, "effective next quarter." There it was. Not explosive. Administrative. "I appreciate the years you've kept this company stable," he said, choosing his words deliberately. "Your diligence has never been in question." That almost made me smile. "My alignment was," I replied gently, a faint exhale, not quite a laugh. "Yes," he admitted, "your alignment." We held eye contact for a few seconds, not adversarial, not friendly, just honest. "You could have handled this differently," he said. Not accusing, reflective. "I did," I answered. He considered that. "You documented early." "Yes." "You separated authority." "Yes." "And you never escalated." "There was nothing to escalate," I said calmly. "There were differences in interpretation." I clarified mine. He leaned back in his chair. "You forced governance reform without filing a complaint." I tilted my head slightly. "I protected my name." Silence again. This time it wasn't heavy. It was an acknowledgement. He opened the folder and slid a document toward me. "A transition proposal," he said. "If you choose to move on, the company will offer severance aligned with tenure, clean reference, no dispute. If I choose to move on," the autonomy in that phrasing mattered. "I've accepted another position," I said evenly. His eyebrows lifted slightly. "Already?" "I believe in optionality." For the first time in months, he gave a small, genuine smile. "That you do." We both understood what had happened. No scandal had erupted, no charges filed, no public humiliation. But the structure had shifted, and it shifted because someone refused to blur their name into collective intent. As I stood to leave, he said one final thing. "You were right to protect yourself." It wasn't an apology. It was recognition. I nodded once. I was right to protect the company too. Because integrity, when consistent, does both. I walked out of that conference room without adrenaline, without triumph, just clarity. Confrontation doesn't need volume to be final. Sometimes it's two professionals acknowledging that one chose alignment and the other chose accountability. I no longer work in that glass building overlooking the river. My new office is smaller, quieter. The company is less flashy, less aggressive about growth. But the reporting structure is clean. Authority lines are defined. Compliance isn't framed as caution, it's framed as a foundation. And I sleep differently. Not because my new role is easier, because my name feels undiluted. When I left, there was no farewell speech about new adventures. No dramatic LinkedIn post about bold transitions, just a brief email. "Thank you for the opportunity to contribute. I wish the company continued stability." Stability. I chose that word intentionally. In the months since, I've thought often about what changed in me. It wasn't courage in the loud sense. I never stormed into a board meeting. I never accused anyone of corruption. I never tried to win. What changed was my understanding of responsibility. For years, I believed that being dependable meant absorbing tension. That if I just worked harder, documented carefully, and corrected quietly, the system would reward consistency. But consistency without boundaries invites assumption. I had allowed myself to be defined as structural support without structural authority. That was my part in it. Now, when I enter meetings, I sit closer to the head of the table. Not for dominance, but for visibility. When decisions intersect with compliance, I speak early, not after narratives have formed. Not louder, earlier. There's a difference. I no longer equate silence with professionalism. Silence is a tool, not an identity. I've also stopped apologizing for precision. Accuracy is not rigidity, it's protection. Sometimes I think about Daniel, about Alex. I don't feel bitterness. If anything, I feel a strange empathy. Pressure distorts judgment. Growth expectations blur edges. People convince themselves that small shifts are harmless until they accumulate. I don't know what the long-term outcome was for them. Governance tightened. Oversight expanded. That's what usually happens when patterns surface. But I do know this. No one ever questioned my integrity. Not once. And that matters more to me than title or compensation ever could. The silver mechanical pencil still sits on my desk. I use it to review quarterly filings, just like before. If my name is attached to it, it must be true. That hasn't changed. What has changed is this. I understand now that quiet doesn't mean passive. It means deliberate. And deliberate people don't need to raise their voices to shift outcomes. They only need to decide where they stand and refuse to move from it. When people hear the story, they sometimes expect a dramatic ending. A resignation was thrown across a desk, a public exposure, a villain unmasked. But real power rarely looks like that. Real power looks like documentation. It looks like a restraint. It looks like choosing not to blur your name into someone else's risk. I didn't win anything. I didn't destroy anyone. What I did was simpler and harder. I refused to let quiet competence become a silent liability. There's a difference between being a team player and being a shield, between alignment and erasure, between flexibility and distortion. And those differences don't show up in one explosive moment. They show up in small phrases, just temporarily. Everyone does it. Let's present it differently. We need to be unified. Each one is harmless on its own, until they aren't. The night before the tax inspection, when my boss asked me to fix the numbers, he probably believed he was protecting the company, smoothing optics, preventing scrutiny. But what he called an adjustment could have sent me to prison. Not metaphorically, legally. And the truth is, if I had adjusted once, it would have been easier to adjust again, and again, and again. Integrity erodes quietly. So does dominance, the quiet kind. The kind where you don't argue louder, you position better. Where you don't threaten, you document. Where you don't expose, you step aside and let the structure reveal itself. If you are the reliable one in your workplace, the calm one, the one who fixes everything without credit, ask yourself this: are you valued, or are you being positioned to absorb what others don't want attached to their name? I'm curious what you would have done in my position. Would you have complied once, trusting it wouldn't go further? Or would you have drawn the line early, before the line started moving? Let me know in the comments.